important to know a definition of the dreaming, only because if you were to get a question on this first dot point, which is Aboriginal spirituality as determined by the dreaming, you'd want to start off with a sentence for your structure that defines it. So dreaming is a non-Aboriginal term used to encompass the complex worldview of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's a metatemporal concept that incorporates the past, present, and the future as a complete and present reality. It's inextricably connected to land and identity, and it's communicated through art, song, dance, story, ritual, and kinship. I think the most important part of that is the inextricable connection to land and identity. That is like probably the most important point from this entire syllabus, and it overlies everything, because when you are talking about dispossession and you are talking about the land rights movement, it all links back to identity and land and how that stripped them of that and took them away from that, which is then affecting their relationship with the dreaming, and is just having that inextricable connection between the past, present, and future within their present reality. So underneath the dot point of dreaming, first comes the dash point of kinship, which is a highly sophisticated network of relationships traditionally accepted by Australia's Aboriginal peoples, including particular rights and obligations to the land or tribe. It includes biological relationships and totemistic relationships. It's connected to totems and expressed through skin names, which are both key to identity. It's a social organization and ensures the young and old are cared for, and it's a way of inheriting ceremonial rights and responsibilities. So terminology is really important, and this this was part of the notes of the Marking Centre from the 2015 HSC short answer, where they said making specific reference to aspects of Aboriginal spiritualities rather than generalizations about land and dreaming. It is so important to have that like sentence about the inextricable connection, but you want to then prove that with the specific references, which you can talk about through totems and skin, and then an example of a totem and what a totem actually is, just as an example. So that's where terminology comes important, and where you can just show your marker that you don't just have like this really general knowledge, like you know it in a bit of better detail. So Mighty is the subdivision of an Aboriginal group into two halves so that privileges and duties can be organised, and there's a reciprocal responsibility held by both to support each other. Totem is an animal, plant, or landform that is the symbol of a specific spirit ancestor in a particular area of land. And they're split between the Mighties to ensure a balance of use and protection. And it's important as the land and its resources are often featured in the dreaming, so that shows the inextricable connection to the land. And a skin name indicates a person's bloodline and conveys information about how generations are linked and how they should interact. So ceremonies are derived from important aspects of the dreaming, and ceremonies are therefore an acting out of the dreaming stories. It usually occurs at a sacred site, which is the importance of land, and this is why everything like is inextricably connected. And art communicates the dreaming, so stories describe Aboriginal law and lifestyle to children. So the role that ceremonies play in Indigenous society, so ceremonies are part of keeping the dreaming continuous in the past, present, and future. It's so that it's preserved and it's passed on for further generations. Ancestral beings are made present through song, dance, music, and objects of the ritual. So thus, the ceremony is not just simply the retelling of the story, but it's more like a reliving of the story, which is why it's so important that they have that access to the land. So for rites of passage to inform both the individual and the wider society of the new social fabric, and some rites of passage include initiation and funerals, which you can use as those kind of specified references that Nessa was asking to. Now for obligations to the land, which is the final dash, it's got to do with how land is a dwelling and resting place for ancestral beings. So learning of one's country is a lifelong process that involves great rights and responsibilities. Aboriginal people see themselves as part of the land, and they believe they came from the land and their spirit will return to it when they die. And in the land, they also see evidence of the dreaming process. So that's really got to do with the inextricable connection between dreaming, identity, and the land. If Aboriginal people see themselves as part of the land, then you can clearly see that the land is their identity and their identity is the land, and then how that's all contributing back to dreaming. So I think I keep going on about that one line and the inextricable connection, but it's honestly because my teacher drilled it into us back in the day, and she was a past HSC SOR marker. And she said it just has to be there. In this topic, like, you just have to talk about the inextricable connection, because it's like the kind of underlying basis of the entire syllabus module. So obligations to the land really revolve around responsibilities of living with the land, including the conservation of the natural and social environment, which is done through instructions passed on from initiated elders to the next generation. And then Aboriginal artwork, song, dance, and ceremonies are all placed within the context of the natural environment. The colours are earth ochres, and tools for art are the natural objects obtained from the earth. And through that, the land is inextricably linked to the individual, which is why individuals need to connect with the land regularly. And in this way, protecting the land allows for a continuation of life in a physical and a tangible sense, which is why the individual needs to have that access to the land. And that's how it then leads on to the land rights and dispossession, when they were taken away from their land, and the effects of that. So even though it's looking at different dashes and diving into different elements of Aboriginal spirituality, at the base is land, identity, and dreaming. And you can see from that that all the dot points kind of flow on in that sense. So then it goes to dispossession. So dispossession refers to the forcible removal of that which belongs to another with a desire to take ownership and deny rights and access to that which was freely theirs to begin with. That's just the general definition of dispossession. Dispossession sought to destroy culture, language, law, and identity of the Aboriginal people. It also sought to destroy traditional structures of ownership, management, and inheritance, and it's responsible for a number of issues still present in Aboriginal communities, such as low life expectancy, overrepresentation in prison, and low levels of education. And that's all stemming from dispossession. So we're going to look at kinship group, separation of land, and stolen generations. Now, when you're using examples with Aboriginal spirituality, you want to incorporate specific ones to reflect your Band 6 understanding, which is what we were talking about before in that marking center feedback, to be more specific and not just making generalizations about the context. About the content, but the nature of Indigenous life actually means that examples and ceremonies are really going to vary depending on the country, so there's no generalized kind of rule. So if you are incorporating an example and mentioning the variety of existences, will signal to your marker that you understand that it's all encompassing, and the nature of the dreaming is all encompassing, but it is highly unique to the country. So for example, male initiation example that you could be is that ancestral beings ingest the boy and spew him out a man. For female initiation, after menstruation, the girl is bathed and painted in ochre. Funeral ceremonies, song and dance helps return the spirits to ancestors. Possessions are destroyed. And kinship, the mighty of the Guringai nation is crow and seahawk. I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrect. But that's just an example of how you can bring in a specific example, and you can imagine how that's much better than just saying ceremonies and that dash of ceremonies to the land. If you actually mention, for example, a funeral ceremony, that's going to show your marker that you just understand the encompassing but unique nature, especially if you mention the variety of existences and how they can differ depending on the country. Back to it with dispossession. So the history of Indigenous people can be told as a series of examples of dispossession, warfare, and conflict. In some parts, massacres and large-scale poisoning of Aboriginal nations occurred, and this genocidal activity caused the destruction of whole tribes, because it was a genocide. Now, the effect of dispossession on Aboriginal communities has been enormous and long-lasting, but dispossession refers to removal from family, which was a loss of self-identity and a loss of spirit in life. Removal from land, which then causes a loss of spiritual identity and a loss of purpose in life, and removal from kinship, which is a loss of human identity and a loss of relationship in life. So dispossession just led to a complete loss of purpose, of identity, of spirit, and of relationship, which is really the core of who we all are, which is why we study it. And I think that when we talk about the inextricable connection, we've got loss of self-identity, spiritual identity, and human identity. So it completely stripped them of their identity by removing them from their land. and from their family and from their kinship. So that's just another really important just an important point to note, and being able to distinguish that it wasn't just their self identity, it was their human identity, but also their spiritual identity, and just those facets and the dimensions of that. So this was the direct result, and dispossession was the direct result of protection policies and assimilation policies, which were both government strategies. So, protection policies have the stated aim of removing Aboriginal people from so called unsuitable environments and placing them in the protection of the state by detaining them in homes or missions. So, they're more protected by being detained instead of their unsuitable environment, which is their land, which is inextricably connected to the dreaming and to their identity. While the assimilation policies had the aim of taking Aboriginal people, particularly those who were white passing, which they often called half caste, and had them assimilated into white society so that their Aboriginality would have been forgotten. And you can understand what effect that's going to have on their link to the land, but also who they are and their identity. Um, and back to the dreaming, which is the all encompassing nature of the spirituality. So that's how everything kind of flows on, and it's really that flow on effect that this dispossession affected everything, their entire identity and their entire spirituality. So it separated Aboriginal people from their culture and religion, and from that, just their culture and spirituality altogether. It was hoped that by separating Aboriginals from their land, the culture, language, law, and identity would be destroyed because people were moved to reserves and government and church missions. And it had destroyed traditional structures of ownership, management, and inheritance because it created a lack of purpose, and it was an inability to draw an ancestral presence, especially when a lot of children were stolen, and they really struggled to draw back on that ancestral presence, and refine their mothers and their fathers and their sisters and their brothers. And separation from and therefore destroys traditional spirituality, and many of the rituals and ceremonies is inseparably linked to the land of a particular sacred site. So if you're separated from that and taken away from that, naturally that's going to destroy your spirituality. So, separation from kinship groups was the denial of the opportunity to express their religion and their spirituality through their community. It made it impossible for Aboriginal people to preserve their own language, and many lost their opportunity to participate in rituals. And like we saw before, the nature of dreaming is through ceremonies and is through the rituals. So that creates that sense of not belonging, and that's been one of the most major consequences. And many found it difficult to then reconnect with their kinship heritage and participate in the native title claims because they had been away from it for so long. And the responsibility for raising children was also shared within the kinship group. So when the children were separated, the parents, but also the wider community, lost connection with the children. So it was affecting everyone, and that's separation from kinship groups. So again, there's separation from identity, as totemic responsibilities linked to the land are disrupted and fragmented, and then the roles of elders is also undermined, and oral tradition and knowledge cannot continue because you're separating the streamline of continuance. And we've got this quote here where it creates a void where there's essentially like, what's left? You've taken everything. And that separation from the land, and the land having such a core focus on identity and dreaming, just strips to turn it into this void and what they had done. So the stolen generations is a flow on from this, and it falls under the policy of assimilation, where the World Council of Churches stated it represented a clear intent to eliminate an independent race and culture in 1971. Other policies include the Aborigines Protection Act of 1909, which made Aboriginal people wards of the state, and more broad missionisation, which was smoothing the pillow of a dying race. And we've got this quote from a mission. And Indigenous Australians would be classified as flora and fauna until the referendum in 1967. So they weren't even classified as people. They were classified as animals and plants, legally, until the referendum in 1967, which wasn't even that long ago when you think about it. And then they were first given the chance to vote in 1972. And then we've just got a little comment on why Whitlam's government had such an emphasis on Indigenous rights afterwards. So, though it's not explicitly in the syllabus, it is good to have an understanding of the longer term impacts of the policies, because you definitely could get a question that it wouldn't necessarily ask for the longer outlook, but it could imply it, and talk about like the effects of the stolen generations. And of course, you could talk about the effects of like the contextual effects of what happened then, but you would strengthen your response by talking about the contemporary effects of it now and how it's still appearing now. So, despite Indigenous Australians making up 2.7% of the population, they're overrepresented in prison, making up 20% of the population. That's one of the impacts of dispossession. There's also a 20% employment rate in the community, and this was pre-pandemic, with drug-related mental illness occurring at 5 times the rate of their white counterparts. And overall life expectancy is up to 10 years less, and only 1 in 10 Indigenous Australians are financially secure. So it's removing them from their families, it's removing Aboriginal people from their kinship groups, and it's also removing Aboriginal systems of responsibility and identity, which is why we put in that quote about that void, because once you've taken all this away, you've really left nothing, and it's very unfortunate. We've got this quote from the Anglican Church of Australia where they've said high rates of social dislocation and Aboriginal imprisonment is the direct result of the separation of children from their families in which the church was complicit, which is also, it is from the Anglican denomination, but it's showing that impact in the present, and the how that the separation and how dispossession was the catalyst for this social dislocation and Aboriginal imprisonment, and these statistics and this overrepresentation today all comes from this separation, and all comes from the separation and removal from families, kinship, and from identity.